The first truck arrived at 6:40 on a Tuesday morning in early April, when the frost had not yet decided whether to stay or go. Waverly Doss stood on the porch of her grandfather's house in Calder's Creek, Vermont, wearing a flannel shirt that had belonged to Harlan Doss for longer than she had been alive. The shirt was 2 sizes too large across the shoulders, frayed at the left cuff, still carrying somewhere in its fibers a faint suggestion of sawdust and machine oil that no amount of washing had ever fully removed. She had not washed it since finding it folded on the shelf above the wood stove. She was not sure she intended to. The truck was a flatbed from Blackwood Apple Growers, the name stenciled in faded green on the driver's door. The man behind the wheel did not introduce himself. He backed the truck along the rutted lane beside the barn with the practiced indifference of someone who had done the same thing 1,000 times, in 1,000 different yards, dropped the tailgate without ceremony, and let gravity finish the job. What came out was not what Wave had imagined when Dane Blackwood described the arrangement over the phone 2 weeks earlier. She had imagined damaged fruit, bruised skins, maybe some soft shoulders. What came out was a slow avalanche of something closer to decay in progress. Split flesh glistening in the gray morning light, skins the color of old copper gone dark. The smell arriving a full second before the sound sweet and fermented and sharp enough to make her eyes water at 20 feet. The truck driver glanced at her once on his way back to the cab. Not with judgment, not with curiosity, with the expression of a man who had stopped being surprised by anything landowners did with their property sometime around the Clinton administration. The neighbor who lived at the far end of the county road, a retired electrician named Bert Hadley, who had already slowed his pickup twice in the past week to peer through the gap in the tree line, pulled over completely this time. He rolled his window down. Wave watched him study the pile now steaming faintly in the cold morning air, watched him work something around in his mouth, the way men of his generation did when they were deciding whether to say the polite thing or the honest thing. He went with honest. "Honey, are you burying something under there?" Wave raised her coffee cup in a gesture that was not quite a toast. "Not yet." Bert Hadley drove away slowly in the manner of a man filing information for future reference. She stood on that porch for another 20 minutes after the truck left, long enough for the coffee to go cold, long enough for the frost to make its decision and begin retreating from the grass in thin wisps of vapor. The pile of rejected apples sat behind the barn like an accusation or like a question, depending on how the light hit it. She had not yet decided which. What she knew. Standing there in Harlan's shirt with cold coffee and no clear direction, she could have explained to Bert Hadley or anyone else was that the smell did not bother her the way it probably should have. There was something honest about rot. It did not pretend to be anything other than what it was, matter in the process of becoming something else, whether or not anyone stood around to watch. 18 months earlier, she had been the kind of person who would have driven past without slowing down. The city of Boston operates at a frequency that is easy to confuse with purpose. Wave had lived inside that frequency for 4 years after college, working in the communications department of Farmerbridge Incorporated, a mid-sized pharmaceutical company headquartered in a glass tower in the Seaport District where the light off the harbor made everyone look more important than they were. She had been good at the job. That was the part that made everything that followed complicated in ways she was still sorting through. Her official title was Senior Communications Associate, which meant she wrote press materials, managed media relationships, and translated the company's clinical trial results into language that journalists could use without requiring a pharmacology degree. She was precise about language in the way that people who grew up correcting their own book reports are precise not as performance, but as reflex. When a word did not mean what someone was using it to mean, the wrongness registered in her body before her brain had finished processing it. That reflex was what got her into trouble. The drug was called Cardivex. It was a blood thinner phase 3 trials aimed at a class of cardiac patients who currently had limited options. The trial results were promising enough that the company had already begun drafting the regulatory submission. Wave's job was to help develop the communication strategy around the anticipated approval. She was given access to the internal data summaries. She was given access because no one imagined she would read them the way she read them. The number that stopped her was buried in a supplementary table on page 47 of the Phase 3 summary document. It was a subgroup analysis, a breakdown of outcomes in patients over 70 with prior kidney disease. The adverse event rate in that subgroup was 14.3%. The adverse event rate listed in the Communications Ready summary that WAVE was supposed to use as the basis for her press materials was 6.1%. The difference was not a rounding error. It was not an interpretation difference. It was not a preliminary versus final dataset issue, which was the first explanation her supervisor offered when she raised the discrepancy privately. She checked the methodology section. She checked the amendment dates on both documents. She went back through 3 previous versions of the summary to see whether the number had changed legitimately somewhere in the revision process. It had not. The 14.3% had been in the source data through every version. The 6.1% had appeared in the communication summary for the first time in the version prepared for executive review 6 weeks before the regulatory submission deadline. She put both documents on the desk of the company's chief medical officer on a Wednesday afternoon in October. She was on administrative leave by Friday morning. The official reason given in the termination letter that arrived 4 weeks later was repeated failure to meet performance expectations and inability to collaborate effectively with the communications team. There was not a single word in the letter that was technically false. There was not a single word in it that had anything to do with why she had actually been let go. The lawsuit took 14 months. Her attorney was honest with WAVE from the beginning about the odds. Pharmaceutical companies did not lose whistleblower cases because they were right. They lost them occasionally because the documentation was airtight enough that settling cost less than litigating further. The documentation in WAVE's case was substantial, but not airtight, partly because the company had moved to restrict her access to internal systems within 48 hours of her first complaint. She had screenshots. She did not have the full audit trail. The court found in the company's favor on the primary wrongful termination claim. The case settled on 2 minor procedural points for a number that covered less than half her legal fees. She was 25 when the lawsuit ended. She had $4,300 in checking, no job, a lease she could no longer afford on an apartment in Somerville, and a professional reputation in pharmaceutical communications that had been made radioactive in a way that would not become visible until she started sending out applications. What she did not have and would not understand the value of until much later was any doubt about whether she had done the right thing. Her grandfather died 4 months after the lawsuit ended. Harlan Doss, 84 years old, went in his sleep on a Thursday night in late November in the same bed he had slept in for 61 years in the farmhouse outside Calder's Creek. He had known he was dying for 8 months and had used that time to put his affairs in order with the same methodical attention he brought to everything, which meant the property transfer to WAVE was clean, the title was clear, and the single-page letter he left with his attorney contained instructions so specific that the attorney had commented without meaning to that it was the most organized estate he had processed in 20 years of practice. WAVE drove up for the funeral on a Saturday in December when the roads were clear, but the sky had that particular Vermont white that means more snow is a certainty rather than a possibility. She stayed 3 days beyond the service, sleeping in Harlan's house for the first time since childhood, waking each morning to the particular silence of 14 acres with no near neighbors drinking coffee on the porch, while the cold sat on her skin in a way that felt less hostile than the cold in Boston, which always seemed to arrive with the city's ambient noise and lose some of its integrity. On the 3rd morning, she called her landlord in Somerville. 10 days later, she returned to Calder's Creek with 4 boxes and nothing she could have explained to anyone in terms they would have found reassuring. The property told the story of Harlan Doss without requiring any narration. The farmhouse was sound in its bones but honest about its age. The porch listed slightly to the left, the result of a frost heave in the foundation that Harlan had documented in a notebook labeled House Issues Running List, dated entries going back to 1994. Inside the house operated on a system of organization that WAVE took nearly a week to fully decode. Nothing was where convention suggested it should be. The tools were distributed throughout the property at the locations where they were most likely to be needed. A hammer near the fence line, tin snips near the barn roof. Access a coil of wire in the cabinet under the porch stairs. The kitchen cabinets contained dated labels noting when each item had been placed there, not purchase placed. The distinction mattered to Harlan apparently, and Wave found herself without quite deciding to beginning to understand why. The drawer at the bottom right of the kitchen cabinet, the one that stuck and required a specific upward pressure on the handle before it would open, contained two things. A ring of keys, each one tagged with a piece of masking tape, and a handwritten label in Harlan's compact script. And a notebook, not a spiral notebook, not a composition book, but something closer to a journal with a cover of dark brown leather, worn smooth at the corners from handling. No title on the cover, no name, no date. Wave set the notebook on the kitchen table and stood looking at it for longer than she had looked at much of anything in recent months. She opened it to the first page. Harlan's handwriting, tighter than she remembered from birthday cards, the letters leaning slightly forward as if walking into wind. The first line read, "The apples that look worst are usually the ones that have been working hardest." She read the next 3 pages standing at the kitchen table with her coat still on. Then she closed the notebook and put it back in the drawer. She was not ready for the rest of it yet. Cecil Pruitt was mentioned by 4 different people before Wave went looking for him. The woman at the hardware store mentioned him in the context of the barn's electrical. The mail carrier mentioned him in the context of misdirected post that Harlan had always made sure got where it needed to go. Bert Hadley mentioned him specifically in connection with a locked-out building behind the main barn, a structure slightly smaller than the main barn, with a metal door conspicuously newer than everything around it, secured with a padlock that was newer still. "Cecil Pruitt knows about that building," Bert had said in the tone of a man who knows more than he is saying. The fourth person mentioned Cecil unprompted when Wave identified herself as Harlan's granddaughter. Cecil was with Harlan for years before he went over to Blackwood. He'll know things about that property that aren't written down anywhere. Wave drove to Blackwood Apple Growers on a Thursday morning in the second week of April. She found Cecil Pruitt in the equipment barn running a diagnostic on a conveyor belt motor, with the unhurried precision of someone who had decided long ago that hurrying made motors worse rather than better. He was tall-built along lean lines with hands that carried the specific calluses of outdoor work distributed at the pressure points. His hair had gone fully gray and was cut close. There was a scar along his left forearm, pale and long-heeled, the kind that comes from surgical intervention or something that happened fast and close. He did not look up immediately when Wave came in. When he did look up, his assessment of her was direct and brief and contained no particular warmth. "You're the Doss girl." Not a question. "Waverly Doss." She extended her hand. He shook it with a grip that was neither demonstrative nor perfunctory. "I'm told you might have a key to the outbuilding behind the main barn on the property." Cecil considered this. He set down the diagnostic tool. "Who told you that?" 4 different people independently. Something shifted slightly in his expression. Not a smile exactly, more an acknowledgement that 4 independent sources constituted a category of evidence he was willing to take seriously. He reached into the breast pocket of his canvas work jacket and produced a key on a ring with a single piece of tape on it. The tape said in handwriting that was not Harlan's and not Cecil's, but something older and more formal. "Secondary storage, Harlan E. Doss." "Your grandfather gave me that 3 years ago," Cecil said, "week before he went into the hospital the first time. He said to give it to you when you came back." He held the key out toward her, but did not immediately release it when she reached for it. "He said if you came back." He knew the difference between if and when. Wave looked at him steadily. "He didn't tell you I was coming." Cecil released the key. "He knew the difference," he repeated and said nothing further. She drove back to the property with the key on the passenger seat, and the weight of that distinction sitting somewhere in her chest in a way she did not immediately examine. The outbuilding was approximately 30 feet by 20, built of the same vertical board and batten construction as the main barn, but with reinforced framing that suggested Harlan had put specific thought into what he intended to do with the space. The metal door was heavy-gauge steel, hinged to a frame surround set in concrete rather than wood. Wave turned the key. The lock opened without resistance. The smell that came out was not what she expected from a space sealed for 20 years. It was dry and cool and carried something faintly tannic, a ghost of something that had once been actively alive in there. Along the left wall, 12 barrels. Not industrial plastic drums, not rusted fermentation vessels. Oak barrels, proper ones in two sizes covered with canvas tarps laid over them with deliberate care. She pulled the nearest tarp back. The wood was dry but not split, the hoop still tight. Someone had treated these barrels before storing them. On the shelf running along the back wall, a binder clip holding a stack of pages inside a sealed plastic bag. Wave lifted it off the shelf. Inside through the plastic she could see handwriting. Harlan's handwriting. She sat down on the concrete floor and opened the bag. 38 pages handwritten on yellow legal paper dated in a range from 1983 to 1987. The title on page 1 underlined twice apple cider vinegar process notes and observations. What followed was not a recipe in any conventional sense. It was closer to a scientific log batch numbers dates pH readings recorded with a handheld meter. Observations about fermentation rates at different ambient temperatures. Notes on the behavior of different apple varieties. The writing became more confident as the pages progressed, the handwriting shifting from careful to fluent, as a man who had figured something out stopped second-guessing his penmanship. Page 38 ended mid-sentence, not with a period, not with a concluding observation. Mid-sentence, in the middle of a note about the fermentation behavior of a specific apple variety, the sentence simply stopped. The next page did not exist. Wave sat on the concrete floor for 3 hours, with the pages spread around her reading and rereading, building in her mind the shape of what Harlan had been doing in this building in the years before she was born. He had been further along than anyone outside these walls had known. He had developed a process that was methodical, replicable, grounded in chemistry. He had taught himself from first principles. He had stopped mid-sentence. He had sealed the pages and covered the barrels and locked the door and given the key to Cecil Pruitt with instructions contingent on a condition. When she walked out of the outbuilding into the April afternoon, the pile of rejected apples behind the main barn was still there. She looked at the pile and then looked back at the open door of the outbuilding and thought about a sentence stopping in the middle of an idea. Page 39. It was not a plan. It was the only thing she could think of that was worth doing with the rest of the afternoon. Dane Blackwood came to the property on a Wednesday morning in the third week of April, arriving in a red F-25. Oh, that was clean in the way working trucks are clean when their owners have decided cleanliness is a form of information. He was 58 years old, built for durability rather than impression, with a face that had been outdoors in Vermont weather for 5 decades and showed the record of that accurately. The arrangement he proposed was straightforward in the way that arrangements made by practical people tend to be straightforward. His operation generated a volume of rejected fruit each season that currently cost him real money to dispose of. Tipping fees hauling to a composting facility in the next county diesel for the trucks. If someone with adjacent acreage was willing to accept the deliveries, both parties benefited. He would send 1 truck per week Tuesdays. She would accept delivery. He would not charge her for the fruit. Wave said yes before he had finished the sentence, which made him pause in the way of a man who had expected negotiation. The paperwork was a standard agricultural land use agreement, 4 pages. She skimmed it at the kitchen table while Dane drank coffee. At the door, he paused without turning around fully. Your grandfather was a careful man. Most people around here thought that meant he was slow. He wasn't slow. It was not quite a compliment and not quite a warning. He went to his truck and drove down the county road. Wave sat at the kitchen table with her copy of the agreement. She read it through completely, this time with the particular attention she brought to documents after 14 months of learning what the difference was between what a document said and what it meant. Page 2, Section 6, in the event that the property failed to demonstrate verifiable agricultural or commercial activity, Within 180 days of the agreement's execution, Blackwood apple growers retained right of first refusal to purchase the property at current assessed valuation. The clause was standard language in agricultural land agreements across Vermont. Almost never relevant. Almost never. The assessed valuation on Harlan's property had been recalculated 2 years ago after 3 years of the land sitting unused. The number in the county records was 55% below what the property would appraise at if someone could demonstrate it was in active agricultural use. The clause was not a trap. Dane had not designed it with her in mind. But with Wave, it had a specific meaning: 180 days to prove the land was alive. She started on the first batch that weekend. The cider press in the main barn had seized with rust, but yielded to 3 hours of penetrating oil and patience. Wave had spent the week reading not cookbooks, not lifestyle fermentation guides, but 2 textbooks on food microbiology and fermentation chemistry, sourced through interlibrary loan. She read them at Harlan's kitchen table in the evenings with a yellow highlighter and a legal pad she had begun using for her own notes separate from his, her handwriting next to his by proximity rather than by plan. She did not sanitize the equipment first. This was not ignorance. She had read the relevant passages. It was the particular optimism of someone who has absorbed information theoretically and has not yet experienced the gap between theory and practice with their hands in it. 8 days later, when she lifted the cloth from the first bucket, the gray film on the surface was so dense it looked almost solid. The smell was nothing like fermentation. She stood at the bucket for 30 seconds. Then she carried it outside, emptied it, rinsed it, brought it back inside. She opened her notebook and wrote, Batch 1, Day 8, mold, gray, total loss, cause insufficient sanitation, sanitize before not after, start over. She did not allow herself anything beyond the notation. She had 171 days remaining on a contract that could take everything her grandfather had left her. The next morning, she drove to the farm supply store and bought food-grade sanitizer. She sanitized everything in the barn that would come into contact with the next batch, including surfaces she was not certain needed sanitizing, because her new working policy was that certainty was less useful to her than thoroughness. Cecil Pruitt appeared at the property again on the morning of the 3rd week in April without announcement. Wave became aware of him because the sound of hammering on the fence line broke the silence of the early morning, and when she went to investigate, she found Cecil working on a post that had been leaning at an increasingly problematic angle. He did not pause. Post was going to go before summer, would have taken the section with it. Wave said nothing. He had not asked permission. She went back inside and brought out 2 cups of coffee, set one on the fence rail. Within his reach, went back to the barn. Later that morning, he knocked on the barn door and looked inside at the setup. He looked at the notebook. He looked at the buckets. He looked at the press. His face arranged itself into the expression of a man who has formed an assessment he has not yet decided whether to share. Harlan tried this, he said finally. I know, I read his notes. Cecil was quiet. The quality of his silences was something Wave was beginning to understand. They were not empty, they were evaluative. He was deciding what category to put her in. The neighbors are going to talk, already are. They'll have something more interesting to talk about eventually. She picked up a cloth and began wiping down the press. Or they won't, and they'll keep talking about the apples. Either way. Cecil picked up his coffee cup. He drank from it, set it back, turned toward the barn door. At the threshold, he stopped, not turning around. Second bucket from the left. The hinge on the press isn't aligned right. You're losing juice pressure on that side. Then he walked across the yard and got in his truck and drove back to Blackwood. Wave looked at the second bucket from the left, then at the hinge alignment, and found that he was correct on both observations. Batch 2 began on a Monday morning in the first week of May, when the last of the ground frost had finally conceded. Wave had corrected every variable she could identify. The sanitizer was applied twice to every surface. The microbiology textbook was open to the contamination chapter, held flat with a piece of barnwood on the corners. The apple selection was more deliberate, overripe, but not collapsing skins split in places, but still holding structure. The wild yeast already present on the skins would start fermentation on its own, as Harlan's notes had circled twice on page 4. By the end of the first week, batch 2 was fizzing in the covered buckets with the specific energy of something genuinely alive. By the end of the second week, the liquid had clarified, the smell had deepened in the direction of alcohol, dry, clean, purposeful. The alcohol conversion was complete. She sealed the buckets with their tight-fitting lids. She moved them to the coolest corner of the outbuilding. She began the waiting period that would convert the alcohol to acetic acid. 6 weeks later, she opened the buckets. The liquid inside was unchanged. No acidification, no vinegar smell, no mother culture forming. The alcohol had simply remained alcohol. She pulled Harlan's notes from the shelf. Page 12. The notation she had read 3 times before but not fully processed: needs air, bacteria require oxygen exchange to work, do not seal. The word do not underlined once. The word seal underlined twice. She had sealed the containers. She had read the note. She had sealed them anyway because the instinct of someone who had learned to be careful with things told her that things left open spoiled, that sealing was a form of protection. Harlan had known this instinct. He had underlined the counter-argument twice. She recorded it clinically, batch 2. 6 weeks alcohol stage only. No acidification. Cause sealed containers blocked oxygen. Cloth covers not lids through entire process. She underlined the last 3 words in the same way Harlan had underlined things when he needed to be certain he would not make the same mistake twice. The notebook was becoming a conversation she was having with a man who was no longer alive to answer back. She found this less strange than she had expected. Batch 3 began in the second week of June. The cloth covers stayed on through the entire process. This time, no lids, no interference with the oxygen exchange the bacteria required. The juice went through its initial fermentation cleanly across 10 days. She tested pH every other morning. The pattern held. On day 19 of acidification at 2 in the morning, the pressure vessel she had set up as a side experiment, 1 sealed glass jug she had included to measure the difference between sealed and unsealed, separated from its lid with a sound like a starter pistol firing in an enclosed space. The lid traveled across the outbuilding and struck the far wall. Wave, who had come out to check a temperature reading she had been unable to stop thinking about, was close enough that the displacement of air registered against the side of her face before the sound fully resolved. She walked to where the lid had landed. She picked it up. She carried it back to the workbench. She set it next to the jug. She sat down on the overturned crate she kept in the corner and waited in the specific silence that follows an event that could have been significantly worse than it was. 15 minutes later, she heard footsteps on the gravel path outside. Cecil Pruitt came in wearing a canvas jacket over what appeared to be pajamas, which was the most human she had seen him look in weeks of intermittent proximity. He surveyed the room, found the jug, found the lid on the workbench, looked at Wave sitting on the crate. He crossed to the small propane burner, lit it, filled the tin kettle. He found the tea on the shelf. He already knew where it was, had known since the second time he had made tea in the outbuilding without asking where anything was kept. He made 2 cups. He set one on the shelf within her reach. He stood at the workbench, looked at the experimental jug, looked at the properly cloth-covered buckets along the opposite wall, none of which had attempted to escape. When he left 20 minutes later, he had not said anything that required a response. He had been present in the way that presence is sometimes the entire content of what is needed. In the morning, Wave went to the notebook and wrote below the temperature reading that had brought her out batch 3 in progress. Side experiment failed spectacularly. Main batch proceeding correctly. Note: Cecil Pruitt knows where I keep the tea. It was the following week that she noticed the pages. Reading Harlan's notes for the 4th time, she became aware that the transition from page 35 to the next page did not feel like a natural leaf. The paper at the right-hand edge was slightly different in texture. Not torn, pulled cleanly with the deliberate care of someone who wanted the removal to be clean, if not entirely invisible. She held the binder up to the light. The stubs were there, narrow, smooth-edged. 2 pages. removed by someone who knew what they were doing. She drove to Blackwood the next morning. Cecil was in the orchard moving through the early summer growth assessment. She waited until he had finished the row he was working on. He came to the fence line. "There are 2 pages missing from Harlan's notes," she said. "Pages 36 and 37. Removed deliberately." Cecil looked at the middle distance for a moment, then at her. "Yes, you took them. He gave them to me." There was a difference in the phrasing that he clearly considered significant. He took them out himself, folded them, put them in an envelope. He said give them to her when she's about to stop, not before. Wave felt the weight of the preposition settle in her chest. When, not if. Harlan had known she would reach a point of stopping. He had prepared for her failure as a contingency rather than as an outcome. "How do you know when that is?" she said. Cecil held her gaze with the steadiness of a man who has held ground in worse circumstances than this conversation. "I've been watching you for 6 weeks, I'll know." She drove back to the property. She did not ask Cecil for the pages. She went back to work. Miles Garrett appeared on a Tuesday afternoon in the 3rd week of June without a phone call or any advance indication that he intended to appear. Wave was at the outbuilding when she heard tires on the gravel, an older Subaru wagon, dark green. The man who got out was 70 years old, built solidly for his age with white hair cut close at the sides. He wore a canvas barn coat with a pen in the breast pocket. He stopped at the open door of the outbuilding, looked inside, took a full inventory without entering. "You're Harlan's granddaughter." Not a question, but the tone was different from Cecil's, less assessment, more recognition. "I'm Miles Garrett. I made wine in Finger Lakes for 35 years. Retired up here 5 years back." He paused. "I saw your post on the fermentation forum, month and a half ago. The question about acetification stalling." Another pause, this one carrying more weight. "I knew your grandfather. We met at the Burlington Farmers Market a few times in the mid-'80s. He bought wine. We talked about fermentation more than either of us expected to. He mentioned a granddaughter." Wave moved back from the doorway to let him in. He entered the outbuilding the way knowledgeable people enter spaces where work is being done without touching anything, reading the arrangement of things before saying anything about them. He spent 20 minutes looking at her notebook. He read the batch records front to back. He cross-referenced them against Harlan's binder. He held page 38 up to the window light the same way she had found the stubs looked at her. "Somebody took 2 pages. They're being held for me, conditionally." He accepted this without asking about the condition. He looked at the current batch, cloth-covered, correct, proceeding in the right direction. "Your pH testing. Show me your strips." He looked at the package. He looked at the readings she had recorded. He set the package down. "These strips are accurate within a range. For vinegar, you need better resolution than a range. You need a digital meter." He reached into the breast pocket of his barn coat and produced a small device, compact, battered at the corners from use. He set it on the workbench. "Keep it. I have another." Wave looked at the meter. "I'll pay you for it. You'll invite me to taste the first batch that's actually good." Something in his expression shifted the acknowledgement that they were now in the early stages of a working relationship, both of them recognized as such. "The mother culture. Do you understand what you're looking for?" She told him what she understood. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he spent 10 minutes filling in the gaps. Not what she had wrong, but what she had incomplete. The mother was not a byproduct of fermentation. It was the mechanism of continuation. Preserving it correctly meant the difference between starting from scratch with each batch and building a culture that deepened over time, each iteration carrying forward the specific biology of the previous one. He walked outside without saying anything. Further crossed the yard, went around the back of the main barn, stood looking at the 7 trees at the far edge of the property. Wave stood beside him. The trees were old. The bark had developed the deep furrowing of significant age. The branch structure spread wide rather than growing tall, the kind of lateral reach that happens over decades without pruning. Miles stood in front of those trees for a full 3 minutes without speaking. He touched the bark of the nearest tree with the flat of his hand, not examining it, just touching it the way you touch something you are making sure is real. Roxbury russet, he said finally. His voice had a quality it had not carried in the outbuilding. One of the oldest apple varieties in North America, almost entirely gone from commercial farming. Your grandfather didn't plant these. These were here before him. He took his hand off the bark. He knew what they were. That's why he never sold the property. Wave looked at the 7 trees. She thought about 38 pages ending mid-sentence. The vinegar from these apples would be different. It would be unrepeatable, Miles said, which is either the same thing or something larger depending on how you look at it. Batch 4 was the first batch where Wave was no longer guessing. She tested pH with the digital meter Miles had left, recording readings to 2 decimal places. She tracked the mother culture's development with the specific attention he had described. She kept a portion of the culture separate in a sealed jar in the cold storage corner, labeled with the date. She sorted her apple input by variety before crushing, keeping the Roxbury russet separate, limiting it to a small portion of the batch, because Miles had told her to understand the other varieties before introducing that variable. The batch moved through fermentation with a reliability that felt, after 3 false starts, almost suspicious. Wave checked it morning, noon, evening for the first 10 days. Nothing went wrong. The mother began forming at day 9, a thin, translucent layer across the surface, faintly iridescent in the outbuilding's morning light. It slowed on day 23. Not completely, the process was still active, the pH still moving in the correct direction, but the rate of acidification had dropped to something that looked on paper like the beginning of another failure. Wave called Miles on the number he had left her. He listened to the readings she gave him. "What are your ambient temperatures in the outbuilding over the past 2 weeks?" She read him the recordings. He was quiet then. "You're running too warm. The acidic bacteria slow significantly above 72 degrees. It's not stalling, it's throttling. Open the north wall vent if there is one. If there isn't, crack the door 2 inches at night." She opened the vent she had discovered on her second day in the outbuilding, but had kept closed without examining why. The batch resumed its correct rate within 48 hours. She added a note to the methodology section. Temperature management is not passive active intervention required through summer months. Miles came back on a Tuesday afternoon as the weekly Blackwood delivery was arriving. He watched the process from a distance, then walked to the pile, picked up an apple, turned it over, smelled it, set it back. He looked at the outbuilding. "How much are you processing per week?" she told him. He did the math she had already done. "You need more consistency in your input. What Blackwood sends you week to week varies based on what came off the trees. You'll need to talk to the man about having specific varieties set aside." Wave thought about the conversation she had not yet had with Dane Blackwood, about the contents of the agreement she had signed, the one she had now read 4 times. "I'll figure out the right time for that conversation." Miles looked at her sideways, a brief, acute look that suggested he understood what she was not saying. "Don't wait too long. Conversations like that get harder the longer they've been postponed." He walked to the 7 old trees again, as he had on his first visit. He was looking at the branch structure of the center tree, the spread of it against the Vermont sky. "Your grandfather and I talked about these trees one time. He told me what variety they were. I remember thinking he seemed more interested in telling me than in selling." He was quiet for a moment. "He said some fruit weights. Not everything good comes when you want it." I thought he was being philosophical. He was being practical. The cold came in the first week of July, not an ordinary cold snap, but a stretch of unseasonable temperatures that no forecast had confidently predicted, the kind of weather Vermont produces occasionally as a reminder that the seasons are not obligated to proceed on schedule. The temperature in the outbuilding dropped 12 degrees in 6 hours on a night when batch 5 was at day 17 of acidification. Its mother culture fully formed, its pH moving in the correct direction. Wave woke at 3 in the morning with the specific alertness of someone whose subconscious has registered an absence of ambient warmth. External sensor on the outbuilding's door frame, 41 degrees outside. She pulled on Harlan's flannel shirt over her pajamas, went out. The outbuilding was cold in the particular way of spaces that have lost warmth they were not designed to hold. She checked the thermometer inside 58 degrees. The acidic bacteria were, per her methodology notes, adversely affected below 60 degrees, not killed but suppressed the mother culture, potentially compromised if the temperature held low long enough. She had no supplemental heating in the outbuilding. She went back to the house and pulled every blanket from the storage chest at the foot of Harlan's bed, the quilts his wife had made, the wool blankets from the cedar closet, the heavy woven throw that had been on the living room couch since Wave's childhood. She carried them to the outbuilding in 2 armloads. She wrapped each bucket, tucked the fabric down around the base, arranged the quilts over the tops, leaving the cloth fermentation covers exposed for airflow. It was not a solution. It was the gap between a solution and nothing, and she had chosen it over nothing. She sat on the overturned crate in the corner, wrapped in the remaining blanket, and waited to see what the temperature would do. It was still dark when she heard tires on the gravel. Cecil Pruitt came in carrying a space heater, not a new one, a garage heater with a dented housing, and a cord repaired at some point with electrical tape. The kind of appliance that has been useful for so long it has earned the right to look used. He found an outlet, plugged it in, adjusted the thermostat, positioned it at the angle that would distribute heat most effectively through the room. He did all of this without acknowledging Wave on the crate. When the heater was running and the temperature had begun to recover, he straightened up and looked at the blanketed buckets. Something in his face moved, not quite amusement, not quite approval, but a compound of both in the proportions of a man who recognizes effort without diminishing it with sentiment. He looked at Wave. Harlan used to sleep in here during the first fermentations. 1985. I found him in the morning with a blanket over the press. He paused. I thought he'd lost his mind at the time. Wave pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. What did you think later? Cecil was quiet for a moment. Then that, he knew what he was doing before the rest of us had the sense to pay attention. He moved toward the door. At the threshold, he stopped without turning. The heater can stay as long as you need it. It's mine, not Blackwood's. Batch 5 died anyway 2 weeks later. Not from the cold, the temperature had recovered, the mother culture had survived. It died from a warm stretch in mid-July that pushed the outbuilding above 75 degrees for 4 consecutive days, despite the open vent, and Wave had not yet acquired secondary cooling because she had been solving the heating problem and had not learned that in Vermont, the distance between too cold and too warm could be covered in under a month. She stood in front of the batch 5 buckets on a Friday morning looking at pH readings that told her the acidification had not merely slowed but reversed. The mother culture was compromised. The batch was a loss. She called her mother that evening, not because she had planned to, but because she had eaten dinner standing at the kitchen counter in the way of someone who did not feel they deserved to sit down, and at some point during the stillness that followed, the phone was in her hand. Her mother's voice when she answered was careful in the way of a woman who has learned not to assume what kind of call she is receiving. Wave said, I don't know what I'm doing here. There was silence on the other end, the silence of someone giving the statement room. Then her mother said, Do you remember why your grandfather left the land to you? The specific thing he told me when he wrote the will. Wave said she didn't. He said Waverly is the only one who loses to me at chess without asking for a rematch. She just sits there until she understands why she lost, and then she tries something different. Her mother's voice was steady, factual, without the softening that would have made it harder to carry. He was not describing patience. He was describing something harder than that. Wave stood at the kitchen window looking at the dark shape of the outbuilding. Batch 5 is gone. All right, her mother said. Batch 6, then. Batch 6 began on the 4th day of August with a precision Wave had not brought to any previous batch because 5 previous failures had given her something no amount of preparation could have generated a specific field-tested, personally expensive understanding of every variable in the room. She had sourced a digital temperature controller, wired it to Cecil's space heater, set the range between 64 and 68 degrees. She had arranged supplemental ventilation using a small fan positioned to move air across the bucket surfaces without disturbing the cloth covers. She had sent a letter to Dane Blackwood requesting a consistent supply of the older variety apples from the northern orchard rows. She had sorted the Roxbury russets separately and used a controlled measure in batch 6 12% of total volume. Not a majority, but enough that their characteristics would register. The mother culture she seeded batch 6 with was drawn from a preserved sample taken from batch 4's culture, the strongest biological material she had produced, kept at the temperature that maintained its viability. Miles had explained the preservation protocol. She had followed it with a specificity that would have seemed excessive to her 6 months ago. 26 days into batch 6, she walked into the outbuilding at 6 in the morning. The smell that met her at the door was different from every previous morning. Sharp but sharp, the way something well-made is sharp, not the undirected sharpness of things going wrong. Complex in the way that complexity is distinct from complication. She crossed to the primary bucket, lifted the cloth, looked at the mother culture on the surface, dense, consistent, a creamy, iridescent layer with a firmness the previous cultures had not achieved. She picked up the wooden spoon she kept on the workbench, Harlan's, from the kitchen drawer, where she had found the notebook, the wood worn smooth at the handle from years of use, the bowl of it stained faintly with things she could not name. She dipped it, lifted it, waited for the excess to drip back. The taste registered first as acid bright, clean direct. Then the complexity arrived, a dryness underneath a faint sweetness at the edges that was not residual sugar, but something the Roxbury russet fraction had contributed a mineral quality she did not have vocabulary for, but that tasted like the soil those 7 old trees had been drawing from for decades, whatever the soil of Calder's Creek remembered from years before she or Harlan or anyone she could name had put a hand to it. She sat down on the overturned crate. She set the wooden spoon across the open notebook. She looked at 38 pages of Harlan's notes on the shelf above the workbench and thought about a sentence that had stopped mid-word about a man who had underlined things twice when he needed to remember them. She did not cry exactly. What happened was adjacent to crying but more interior, a settling of something that had been suspended for a long time. The way pressure equalizes when you finally open a window in a room that has been closed. She picked up the pen. She wrote the date. She wrote the pH reading. Below the data, a single line, batch 6, day 26. This is it. Then she drew a line under it, turned to the next blank page, and began the methodology section for the production process she now knew how to repeat. The first 20 bottles came out of the outbuilding on a Tuesday morning in late September, lined up on the workbench in a row that Wave regarded for several minutes before doing anything about them. She did not keep them for customers. She boxed them into 2 groups and drove them around Calder's Creek on a Wednesday afternoon, leaving them with people rather than selling them. The woman at the feed store who had been kind during the early months. The elderly couple 2 properties over who had never stopped waving when they passed. Bert Hadley, who received his bottle with an expression that moved through surprise, skepticism, courtesy in that order. Cecil Pruitt, who looked at the bottle she set on his porch rail, looked at her, looked back at the bottle, said nothing, put it in his jacket pocket, went back inside. She gave Miles Garrett a bottle on a Thursday morning when he came by. He opened it at the outbuilding workbench, poured a small amount into a clean glass, held it to the light before tasting. The evaluation that followed was silent, the working silence of someone applying a specific professional instrument to a specific task. He set the glass down. How many batches did it take? 6. He picked up the glass again, tasted once more slower. The Roxbury russet fraction, what percentage? 12% of total volume. He set the glass down for the final time. Increase it to 18 in the next batch. Not more than that yet. He looked at her directly. This is ready. The word arrived with more weight than its single syllable suggested, coming from a man who had spent 35 years deciding when things were ready and had not learned to use the word casually. The phone call from Owen Garrett came on a Saturday morning, 5 days after the distribution rounds. The voice on the other end was direct, unhurried, with the specific cadence of someone who spent his professional life in kitchens where economy of communication was not a preference, but a survival skill. My name is Owen Garrett. I run Ironwood Table in Montpelier, A friend gave me a bottle of something you made. I need to know if you have more. Wave looked at the 7 bottles remaining on the shelf. Not at this moment. I'll have more in approximately 2 weeks. A brief pause. I'll take everything you have from this batch, whatever volume that is. Another pause shorter. And I want consistent access going forward, not occasional. Consistent. I'm still scaling the process. Consistency requires infrastructure I'm still building. Owen Garrett's response carried the patience of a man who had opened a restaurant from nothing and understood that infrastructure was built in stages. Then build it. I'll wait. Wave wrote his name in the notebook at the bottom of the batch 6 page. Below it, first paying customer, Montpelier. Consistent supply required. Scale accordingly. When Owen came to the outbuilding to collect his first order 3 weeks later, Miles Garrett was there running through the batch 7 temperature logs. The two men looked at each other across the outbuilding in the way of people who share a long history that contains both closeness and distance. Wave recognized the look, not estranged but complicated in the particular way of fathers and sons who love each other and do not always know what to do with that information. Miles had never mentioned a son. Owen had never mentioned a father. The connection revealed itself in the silence between them and in the fact that both men understood without discussing it that this outbuilding in Calder's Creek was neutral ground where the history between them did not need to be performed. Wave did not ask about it directly. She understood that Miles Garrett had not arrived at her door entirely by coincidence, that the fermentation forum post had been one path to finding her, but that the name Calder's Creek on a map and the name Doss attached to the land might have done some of the navigation first. She filed this under the category of things that did not require explanation to be true. The following morning, she wrote Dane Blackwood a letter 2 pages, the kind of communication that requires the other party to sit down with it. She described what she was doing in the outbuilding, the vinegar she had produced from his rejected fruit, what she needed going forward, specific variety separation rather than mixed loads, priority access to the older variety trees, advance notice of harvest timing. She did not mention the clause on page 2 of their agreement. Dane Blackwood came to the property on the following Thursday. He accepted the coffee she offered. He sat at the kitchen table the first time he had come inside the house and read the letter she had sent him. When he finished, he looked at the outbuilding through the kitchen window. "I want to see what you're producing," he said. She took him to the outbuilding. She showed him the batch 7 setup. She showed him the methodology notebook. She poured him a measure from the last of batch 6. He tasted it the way he tasted it, without commentary, without visible response, with the thorough absence of performance that characterized everything he did. He set the glass down. He looked around the outbuilding once more. His eyes moved to the 12 oak barrels against the wall still covered with canvas. Those were Harlan's. Yes, he treated the wood before he stored them. I remember him working on them. He was particular about things lasting. Dane looked at her. The assessment in his expression was the same one he had brought in April. The variety separation you're asking for requires a change in our sorting protocol. That has a labor cost. He paused. I'm willing to absorb the cost against the disposal savings, but I need to know the arrangement is stable, not a 6-month experiment. The arrangement is stable, Wave said. He stood. At the outbuilding door, he paused with the manner of a man who had one more practical item to add. There are 3 Roxbury russet trees I found at the northern edge of my property line last fall. Old ones. I didn't know what they were until I had someone look at them. He looked at her steadily. I'll sell you the fruit from those trees at cost. Not give sell. We're past the point of gyves. He walked to his truck. He drove down the county road at the same speed he always drove. Wave went back inside to the notebook. She wrote, Dane Blackwood agreed to variety separation northern rows. 3 additional Roxbury russet trees available at cost. Partnership. It was Cecil who noticed the clause. He had been reading the agreement copy she kept on the shelf above the notebook, the habit of a man who had learned at some point in his life that the difference between a good outcome and a bad one was often in whether you had read the paperwork before something happened rather than after. He found Section 11, Paragraph 3, the clause that defined verifiable commercial activity was satisfied by any documented sale of goods produced on the premises. Any, no minimum volume, no revenue threshold. Wave had sold 18 bottles to Owen Garrett in October. She had the invoice in the same folder. She had recorded the transaction in the notebook with the date. The 180-day clause had been satisfied in October, well within the window. She had spent weeks carrying a weight that had already been resolved. Cecil brought the folder to the kitchen table. He laid the agreement open to Section 11, then the invoice beside it, then the notebook open to the October entry. He lined them up with the precision of a man who had learned that the arrangement of evidence mattered as much as the evidence itself. Wave stood at the table looking at the three documents. She looked at the dates. She looked at Cecil. "You went through the folder." "The folder was on the shelf." His tone contained no apology and required none. Harlan kept his agreements in order. "I checked yours the same way I check equipment because it matters whether the thing is working correctly." She looked at the invoice date. The clause had been satisfied with time to spare. It had remained satisfied through every subsequent sale. She pulled out the chair and sat down. "He never mentioned it." Dane, Cecil considered this. Dane runs a business. He put a standard clause in a standard agreement. If it had been relevant, he would have acted on it. It wasn't relevant, so he didn't. A pause. "That's not the same as him not knowing." Wave was quiet for a moment. "Do you think he knew when it was already satisfied?" Cecil's expression was the one he produced when a question contained an answer he considered obvious. "Dane reads his agreements the same way he reads his equipment." Yes, he knew. She thought about a Thursday in October when Dane Blackwood had stood in the outbuilding tasting Vinegar, had said he was particular about things lasting, had offered 3 Roxbury russet trees at cost, before leaving had said, "We're past the point of gyves." Some men extended courtesy by announcing it. Others extended it by not saying anything that did not need to be said. She closed the folder. She put it back on the shelf. "Thank you for checking." Cecil picked up his jacket from the hook beside the outbuilding door. "Temperature controller is running correctly. You can add the second probe now. The wiring is straightforward." He went to the door. "I'll be here Monday morning at 6. The conversation she had been having with Cecil Pruitt across 7 months of proximity had been conducted almost entirely in the currency of action rather than words. They had not had a direct conversation about what they were to each other or what the property was becoming since the day he had told her he would know when she was about to stop. He had not given her the 2 pages. She had not stopped. She found him on a Monday morning at the Blackwood equipment barn running a diagnostic on a machine that was different from the one he had been working on when she had first come looking for him. She waited at the door until he noticed her. "I need to talk to you about something practical," she said. He set down the tool he was holding. He gave her the full attention that characterized him, not a performance of listening, but the actual activity. "I can't produce the volume I'm being asked to produce alone. I need a second person in the outbuilding. Someone who understands fermentation, who understands apples, who doesn't need to be taught the basics from zero." She stopped. "I can't pay what Blackwood pays." Cecil looked at her for a long moment. Outside the equipment barn, the Blackwood orchard moved in the November wind, the sound of mature trees after the season's fruit has been taken, a sound that had been the ambient background of his working life for 30 years. He looked past her at the orchard, then back. "Harlan asked me once why I stayed at Blackwood so long. I told him it was steady work. He said, 'Cecil, steady and necessary aren't the same thing, and you know the difference.'" He picked up the diagnostic tool, set it down again. "I'll need to give Dane 2 weeks' notice. He deserves that." Wave said 2 weeks is fine. The article in New England Table ran in the November issue. The writer had spent an afternoon at Calder's Creek asking questions that suggested she had done research before arriving. The piece was 2 pages with a single photograph. Wave had not staged the 7 old Roxbury russet trees in late autumn. Light the fruit, taken the branches bare. The outbuilding door open in the background, with Cecil visible in the frame, moving past a shelf of bottled vinegar with the air of a man for whom this was simply Tuesday. What arrived in the 2 weeks after the article was a volume of inquiry that required structural response rather than individual management. 41 inquiries from retail buyers, 11 from restaurant operators, one from a regional distributor based in Manchester, New Hampshire, Frank Aldrich, whose note said, "I represent producers who are serious about what they make. If you are serious about distribution, call me." She called him the following morning. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. He asked specific questions about production volume, consistency protocols, shelf stability, labeling, compliance, insurance coverage. She answered accurately, including the things she had not yet completed. Frank Aldrich's response to accuracy was favorable, which told her something useful about what kind of distributor he was. "Get the insurance sorted and call me back. We'll talk about terms." She called Frank Aldrich back on a Friday afternoon 2 weeks later. The terms he proposed were standard for a regional distributor working with a new producer. Not favorable terms given because the article had made her interesting, but standard terms given because the product merited them. The distinction mattered. She signed the distribution agreement on a Monday morning. She read every page before signing. She took her time. No one was waiting for her at a kitchen table with coffee she was not drinking. One more thing arrived before the year ended. Cecil knocked at the kitchen door on a Wednesday evening in late November, which was unusual. He was a morning person in the specific way of people who had organized their lives around the hours when things needed doing. He came in, he sat at the kitchen table, he put an envelope on the table letter size sealed with Wave's name on the front in handwriting she recognized. "He gave me this one separately," Cecil said. "Same time as the 2 pages. He said give this one last, after everything else." He looked at the envelope on the table. "I've been holding it since the article ran. I figured that was close enough to everything else." Wave looked at the envelope. "Did you know what was in it?" "No." He stood. "I'll be at the outbuilding at 6. He left through the kitchen door, closing it behind him with the care of a man who understood that some moments did not need company. She sat at the table for a while before opening it. The envelope contained a single sheet of plain white paper folded once. The handwriting was the same compact script of the notebook, but slower, the letters slightly less certain, the way writing changes in the last year of a long life, when the hands know things the mind is still trying to organize. It said, "I did not finish what I started because I let someone tell me I had no business starting it. I was wrong to listen. I am leaving you the land because you are the one who would not have listened. I know this because you are the only person who ever sat across from me at that kitchen table and lost without asking me to explain what I did wrong. You just looked at the board until you saw it yourself. That is the whole thing. That is all of it. Whatever you make of this place, it was always going to be yours. I just had to wait for you to come back and take it. The 7 old trees leave them. They know what they're doing." Wave folded the letter. She put it back in the envelope. She set it on the table. She sat in the house where her grandfather had slept for 61 years and thought about a man who had been precise enough to label the day he placed something in a cabinet, careful enough to treat oak barrels before storing them for 2 decades, deliberate enough to give a key to a man with instructions, contingent on a condition, and who had written a letter he asked to be delivered last, after everything else, as if he had known what everything else would look like. 3 years after the first truck had dropped its tailgate on a Tuesday morning in April, Calder's Creek Vinegar occupied 47 retail locations across Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Maine. The outbuilding had been extended east into the old equipment shed. 6 fermentation tanks added, a proper cold storage unit installed, the bottling station moved to a dedicated corner with a surface Wave had built from the same scrap lumber she had used for the first shelf. Cecil Pruitt arrived every morning at 6. He checked the temperatures before Wave arrived. He had opinions about the ventilation protocol that he expressed in the form of adjustments rather than arguments. His mailing address was still his own property, but the space heater he had brought on a cold night in the first July lived permanently in the corner of the outbuilding, and no one had suggested returning it. Miles Garrett came several times a year, always on a Tuesday, always before noon. He asked technical questions that required answers Wave had not yet formulated, which was the most useful thing a person with his knowledge could do for a person building hers. Owen Garrett's restaurant in Montpelier had been using Calder's Creek vinegar for 2 years, long enough that it appeared on the menu without explanation. The way ingredients appear on menus when they have stopped being features and have become facts. Dane Blackwood's operation had reorganized its sorting protocol in a way that served both businesses. The variety separation Wave had requested had turned out to improve Blackwood's own quality, tracking an outcome Dane had noted in a brief quarterly call, with the tone of a man who appreciated when efficiency arrived as a side effect of someone else's need. He had sold her the fruit from his 3 Roxbury russet trees at cost. She had offered to pay above cost. He had declined. Bert Hadley, the retired electrician from the end of the county road, had bought a case for his daughter's wedding favors the previous autumn. He had not mentioned the morning he had asked Wave what she was bearing. She had not mentioned it either. He waved from his pickup on Tuesday mornings when the Blackwood trucks came. She waved back. A woman named Colleen Marsh, who had worked in communications at Farmer Bridge and had been in the conference room on the Wednesday afternoon Wave had put the documents on the chief medical officer's desk, had sent a message through the Calder's Creek Vinegar website. She had ordered 5 cases for a company event. She had also written, "I owe you a conversation I was too much of a coward to have years ago. If you're ever willing, I'd like to have it now. If you're not, I understand. I'll buy the vinegar either way." Wave had written back, "I'll send the 5 cases. I'll have the conversation whenever you're ready. There's no deadline on it." She had shipped the 5 cases on a Wednesday. She had not charged Colleen Marsh a different price than she charged anyone else, because the vinegar was the same vinegar regardless of who ordered it. The 7 old Roxbury russet trees behind the outbuilding had flowered in May of the 2nd year for the first time in a period long enough that no one Wave had spoken to could remember them flowering before. The fruit they produced each autumn was small, russeted, unglamorous, nothing that would attract attention in a retail setting. Everything that made the vinegar from Calder's Creek the thing it was rather than a version of something else. The bottles on the shelves of 47 stores carried a label that said what it said without decoration. Calder's Creek Vinegar, Single Origin Apple Cider, Calder's Creek, Vermont. Made from fruit no one wanted. The people who bought them read the label or they did not. The vinegar inside was the same either way. On a Wednesday evening in the 3rd year, Wave sat at the kitchen table where she had first found the leather notebook in the drawer that required upward pressure on the handle to open. The notebook was still in the drawer. She had not moved it. Her own notebook, the 4th volume, its spine thickened beyond what the original binding could comfortably hold, was on the table in front of her. She opened Harlan's letter and read it one more time, not because she had forgotten any of it, because some things are worth reading again when enough time has passed to understand them differently. She read the 7 old trees leave them. They know what they're doing. She folded the letter. She opened her own notebook to a fresh page. She wrote the date at the top. Below it, she wrote the batch, 10 readings she had taken that morning, the temperature projections for the coming week, the apple delivery schedule for Tuesday, the notation about the cold storage unit's thermostat calibration that Cecil had flagged on Monday. Outside through the kitchen window, the 7 old trees were visible in the early dark. 7 shapes she knew by now. The way you know the shape of things you have looked at long enough for them to become part of the view rather than a feature in it. They were bare in November, as they always were, the branches holding their particular lateral reach against the Vermont sky. She was not finished writing. The page was not full. There was more to record because there was always more to record when something was still alive and working and had not yet reached the point where it no longer needed watching. She kept writing.